as ever, really delightful to be back in Bristol. Delightful to be sharing an occasion with three organisations that I know extremely well. With UWE, as you've just heard, as an honorary doctor, which I'm very proud of. It's one of the few occasions I can actually call myself Dr. Porritt. So I want some very respectful Q&A, okay? Obviously with the Green Capital Partnership, which I've known and worked with for a long time, and with Friends of the Earth, and just delighted that Friends of the Earth have been able to join in this. I'm doing quite a bit more work now with Friends of the Earth than I have done for a long time, which is brilliant. And thank you too for inviting me to kind of talk a little bit about some of the benefits that have accrued through our membership of the EU, while simultaneously reflecting on some of those things that have not worked out so well from a sustainability perspective. And obviously with any huge relationship of this kind, you would expect there to be a mixture of benefits and disbenefits, pros and cons, behind something that has shaped environment policy for more than 20 years now. And it's had a massive impact, not just on individual legislative interventions in the UK, but on the way in which we do the environment, the way in which we think about regulation, incentivization, taxation. It's had a huge influence, as I'll explain. And I'm bound to disappear into one or two little details, because this is all about detail as well as about the big picture. But I want to start really by thinking about some of the high-level aspects about why. Am I getting a lot of feedback to you as well as to me, or is it just me? No? Okay, good. Some of the high-level reasons why we might be mindful of the EU more today than at any other time in the past, and why we should be very, very cognizant of the huge potential risks associated with ending that relationship in a Brexit vote, as it were. Four big things why people need to think this stuff through from a high-level perspective. The first, well understood, is that many of our environmental issues are clearly not national issues, as in they do not stop conveniently at the borders of our country. They are described as transboundary issues for precisely that reason, and they are only able to be addressed by virtue of transboundary interventions. So collective solutions being brought forward to address things that cross those boundaries. And it is true that I've lived with that reality in the EU for a very long time. When I was director of Friends of the Earth, you're right, Jim, it was quite a long time ago. Back in the mid-1980s, the big debate going on at the time then was about the transboundary impacts of pollution, particularly from large coal-fired power plants. And the EU's intervention in those terms, the Large Plant Combustions Directive, the Air Quality Directive, Framework Directive, had a massive influence on the UK and on the rights of other countries to stop being polluted by emissions from our power stations, particularly in Scandinavia. You've probably noticed that people don't really talk about acid rain these days. They do a little bit if they're students of history or have an interest in working out regulatory impacts and what actually happened, but you don't really have a debate about acid rain at the moment. And I can honestly say that is because the interventions that were made at that time, in the teeth of quite strong opposition from the UK, trust me, the interventions that were made then have essentially addressed that aspect of poor air quality impacting on other countries outside our own borders. It's one of the clearest examples of how well-planned regulatory interventions of that kind can make a huge difference. And there are many, many transboundary issues that we need to be aware of. Secondly, we operate within a market economy, as you all know. It's a given that we will continue to operate within a market economy. Nobody really challenges that very much these days. What the market needs to look like is another matter. We might come back to that later, but it's a market economy. And in a market economy, it is crucial that people are able to compete on more or less equal terms. This is the terminology known as the level playing field. And the different businesses in any one sector are not subject to regulatory interventions that penalize them and help their competitors. Now, with the best will in the world, business given half a chance, and we give them many half chances, will always dump as much of the costs of doing business onto other people as they possibly can. It is the nature of the game. It's called cost externalization, and one of the ways that you keep your revenues good and your margins high and your profits looking healthy and dividends to shareholders is dump that part of your cost base somewhere else so that it's not on your P&L, your profit and loss, so that your figures are better as a direct consequence. Cost externalization is a given in all market economies, and businesses will take every available opportunity to externalize cost whenever they can. So in a market such as the EU, we have an opportunity to mandate more of those costs being internalized, brought back onto the P&L, the profit and loss of each individual company, rather than them having permission to go on dumping it on other people, on future generations, whatever else it might be. So from a very high level, the opportunity through the common market, through the EU, to insist on shared standards across all member countries has progressively encouraged more internalization of cost over the last 20 years. And collectively, it's had a really big impact. It's enabled many, many agendas to be more efficiently addressed because business has not been able to say, well, we'd like to do that, but honestly, we can't, because if we do, we'll get hammered by this cost, and all those people out there, they usually mention Spain at this point, or Italy, wherever it might be, they will just go on and take advantage of sloppy legislation, sloppy regulation, and get a benefit by being able to continue externalizing. So from an environmental perspective, if you don't have a mechanism for shared cost internalization, you can pretty much guarantee that the environment will suffer as a direct result. Thirdly, this is a very high level, okay. Thirdly, although it has to be said there are some people in certain political parties in the UK at the moment. Thirdly, there is such a thing as a common heritage across Europe. There is a sense that we share a lot in common, particularly in terms of our physical environment, particularly in terms of our recognition of our shared history, the shared environment that we have, and in certain instances, the degree to which we have the same species and the same interest in different species issues. So to give you one example here again, in the EU, we now face a fairly profound crisis in terms of many of our insect populations, but particularly from the point of view of the status of many bee populations across Europe. It's not just in the UK, across Europe. Now, over the last 10 years or more, evidence has gradually been put together, bit by bit, that one of the principal negative impacts on bee populations across the EU is the widespread use of this particular family of pesticides called neonicotinoids. The EU, through its scientific work, was able to demonstrate that the influence of that family of pesticides was sufficiently disturbing to warrant a ban on the use of 3 of those kinds of pesticides across the EU, because of our mutual interest in bee populations at large. You will all know, of course, that that was not the opinion of the UK government. The UK government fought as hard as it could to stop the imposition of that ban, and is still fighting to stop that ban being continued even today. Honestly, science is of little interest to this government today. It has a set of overarching ideological imperatives, which it has every intention of pursuing, come what may. And the state of science in any particular area seems to be less and less material to the way in which this government makes its decisions. So thank God we have a shared research resource in the EU. We have a shared sense of the importance of acting collaboratively to address some of these issues, and we have been able, as a consequence, to make some really important changes in that regard. Just thinking back to this business about cost internalization, for instance, one of the most important influences that the EU has had has been through something that you hardly ever hear debated here in the UK, through something called the REACH directives. And those directives have had a marked effect on the use of chemicals in many different sectors over the last 10 years. And bit by bit, the ability of the chemicals industry to get a license to pollute, as it were, is being brought back more and more under control. Those REACH directives are really important, negotiated tortuously over many, many years, with different governments taking different positions, but eventually a set of common principles and standards were arrived at, and those standards are now mandatorily applied across the whole of the EU. So on each of these three things, okay, the need to address transboundary pollution, the need to address cost internalization issues, challenges, the need to think about common shared heritage, and to protect special landscapes on a wider than national basis. On each of these things, you can see why the EU has a meta case to be made for it. And then lastly, the fourth of these areas, of course, relates to us in the world, not just us in the EU, but us in the world as the EU and as individual nation states. And increasingly, of course, what you've seen over the last 20 years is the recognition that more and more of these big challenges have to be addressed globally, most obviously of all, climate change. And whichever way you look at it, it's true to say that the UK did once have an honourable record on taking the lead on climate change issues, and the UK Climate Change Act is still seen as an almost uniquely progressive and far-sighted bit of legislation. No other European country has anything like that. So whilst it's true that the UK once took the lead in this space, it is no longer true, and we are increasingly dependent on the EU to help maintain a very strong set of common principles and practices when it comes to the rapid decarbonisation of the European economy that is now necessary. That is something which it is just massively challenging to think how we're going to do that. And the idea of doing that without being in the EU, without being in this marketplace of 500 million people able to benefit from shared knowledge, shared innovation, shared technology, new ways of thinking about these different challenges, able to take our part in international negotiations with a big picture set of commitments arising out of the EU, it's difficult for me to see how that might work at all. And at exactly the time when we actually need to see the world moving more and more towards shared, globally responsible positions, the world coming together to help address many of these different issues, it seems very peculiar to me that we would want to put ourselves in a different position around global issues of that kind. So at a high level, the arguments that can be made for sustainability benefits deriving from the membership of the EU are extremely strong, extremely strong. And when you then begin to look down into the actual details of what's happened in the last 20 years, you can see how some of that has actually panned out, the specifics of what that actually looks like. Depending on which analysis you're reading, there are something like 100 individual interventions which originated in the EU. They're not European legislation, by the way. People love to use that phrase for political purposes, as you understand. They are just as much part of UK legislation as any part of legislation that we introduce without there being a sort of starting impulse in the EU, because we have to incorporate these into our own legislature. None of these directives are imposed upon us. We are full negotiators in those processes. We are full signatories when they are eventually signed off by the Council of Ministers, and we then incorporate into our own legislature. But there are roughly 100, and some of them are enormously influential, just incredibly important pieces of legislation that have dramatically improved the quality of life and the quality of our physical environment in the UK over the last 20 years. If you just take the Bathing Waters Directive, for instance, those of you with a bit of history in this area, if you go right back into the late 1970s when the Bathing Water Directive was first propounded by the EU, almost all of the beaches in the UK were shit-encrusted hellholes. I'm sure many of you of a certain age will have a distinct memory of swimming, as it were, with several motions going on at the same time. It was not pleasant. Even the Labour administration at that time did not welcome this new regulatory standard from the EU. And to start with, I can't remember the exact figure, but to start with, the Labour government at that time only designated 26 out of our 600 or so bathing waters, beaches, to apply or to be brought into that new higher standard. The EU said that was not sufficient. The EU then took out infringement processes against the UK in mid-1980s. Again, I remember this because Friends of the Earth was very involved in that campaign at that time. And bit by bit, in the teeth of government procrastination, opposition, every devious trick in the book, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, we now have arrived at a situation where almost all our beaches in this country are properly protected from contamination through sewage. Not yet fully because of residual problems that continue to this day, but if you look at it as a 20-year history, it's had a massive beneficial impact on people's lives. As, of course, have some of the big conservation-based directives, the BirdLife Directive, Habitats Directive, Natura 2000. These are three very big parts of the overarching set of commitments around the natural environment. Again, people forget this, but if you go back into the 1980s, and this is research that has been done by the RSPB, by the Royal Society for Protection of Birds, we were losing up to 15% of our special sites before the introduction of these two big birds and habitats directives. 15% per annum. Now, these days we're still losing some. This doesn't guarantee protection for the places that are most important. As you know, the growth imperative is still the growth imperative. But the rate of damage, the loss of habitat, has declined significantly since then. So you could pick any one of these big regulatory directives, interventions, and demonstrate how important it has been from the perspective of the physical environment. With that, of course, comes a whole set of slightly boring processes, all to do with the nature of government. The important thing is these are not voluntary. These are mandatory standards. And for a government that has always had a historical preference for doing things voluntarily, for cozy deals stitched up between ministers and the private sector as the best route to cost-effective improvement in the environment. I put that in inverted commas, you understand. Quotes, the best route to cost-effective environmental protection, quotes. That preference goes right back into the 1970s. It's party blind, as it were. Labour's just as bad in this respect, or was. Probably Jeremy Corbyn is a little bit more on the regulatory side of things now than his predecessors. But the Labour Party had just as much the same kind of default preference for doing things by voluntary agreement rather than by mandatory standards. And that is a really significant thing for us here in the UK. Because this government, I can assure you, is no more enamoured of the idea of doing things via regulation than any of its predecessors. And given half a chance, it would unpick much of that mandatory core of environmental legislation and move towards a system whereby more would be left to voluntary standards and the kind of cozy deals that have happened on so many previous occasions. We had one tiny example of that over the last month. The Secretary of State at DEFRA recently decided that the mandatory animal welfare standards for protecting animals, in particular chickens, could be set aside. And the industry would be invited to write its own voluntary standards to protect those farmed animals. Now, to be honest, even farmers thought this was going just a bit far. And the reason why many of those good farmers thought it was going a bit far was that they realized that they would still stick to the same standards. But the so-called free riders, the people who would be seeking lowest cost production systems, would automatically default to far lower welfare standards. And yesterday, DEFRA withdrew that proposal. But you can see the instinct. The instinct is always reduce the burden of regulation, reduce the red tape, do it all through voluntarism, through cozy deals. So this government is up to its eyeballs in the idea that regulation is bad and voluntary agreements are good. So you don't have to be a wizard to understand that should we decide in the referendum that it was time for us to leave the EU, you do not have to be a wizard to realize the impact that that will have very, very quickly on baseline environmental regulation and standards here in the UK. I can't honestly speak to this as definitively as I would like to, because nobody actually knows what the situation would be if we did decide to vote to leave the EU. We have zero clarity on this at all. In fact, what we have is complete and utter confusion from all the different voices representing the Brexit campaign. However, the work done by IEEP, which is the most prestigious body of researchers looking at implications for the UK environment from a Brexit, a possible Brexit move, IIP's research has shown two things. Firstly, if we go for what is called the halfway house, so we're in the EU now with a few exceptions. We've always been exempted from certain things, as you know, but we're kind of fully in there, although it doesn't seem like it sometimes. But if we went to this so-called halfway house, which is we voted to leave the EU now, but wanted to have access to the common market, to the economic marketplace that Europe still is, hugely important to us in trading terms, then we would have to apply to join something called the European Economic Area. And the price of us joining that, not full EU membership, but joining the EEA, is we would have to comply with many of these environmental regulations. Not all of them. Some of them would definitely disappear. The Bathing Water Directive, for instance, would not apply any longer in the EU, in the UK. Probably the Birds Directive, Habitats Directive, would no longer apply. So there would be a sorting out, if you like, but many of the standards that the EU currently applies to all of its members, we would still have to comply with as a member of the EEA, the European Economic Area. This is called the Norwegian model, sometimes a kind of halfway house. We're sort of in, but we're not really in. And of course, the implication of that is we have no influence whatsoever on any of the discussions that are being taken about the future of environmental policy. But because we would be bound by what is known as the acquis, this is practically the only time where the French language still assumes dominance in all of these things, the acquis communautaire, we would have to go along with all of those agreements made by our erstwhile European partners. It doesn't sound like a particularly good deal to me, I have to be honest. If we decided to go the whole hog, as it were, and decided that Norway was not a good model, and that we wanted out completely, without any special arrangements to get back into the trading part of the common market, then everything goes. Everything goes. Or everything could go. We don't know that it would go, and nobody's told us whether it would go or not. You try and get clarity from any of the leading proponents of a Brexit as to what would happen to core environmental policy and regulation here in the UK, you cannot get an answer. And I know because lots of organizations have been trying to tease out that rather fundamental information. We just don't know. We honestly don't know. So you can see why the vast majority of people in the environment world are pretty clear that given the uncertainties and risks associated with Brexit, and given the weight of benefits that have flowed over the last 20 years for the UK in terms of improvements in our physical environment, you can see where the balance lies for most organizations. It is not a wholly rosy picture. I have to be absolutely clear, as someone who's campaigned doggedly for the last 30, 40 years around things like the Common Agricultural Policy, the Common Fisheries Policy, various different approaches to trade, to economic growth. The EU is not perfect. The EU is still as obsessed with a growth imperative as the UK is in its own terms. Growth still trumps pretty much everything. The economic growth at all costs message is still very powerful across the whole of the EU. So it's not perfect. And it took years and years to bring about basic improvements in the Common Agricultural Policy and even more basic improvements in the Common Fisheries Policy. And that's the one thing you do hear from the campaigners, that if we could get out, we could manage all our own farming practices better ourselves without any of these imposed standards and limitations, and we could manage our own fisheries. Well, you won't be surprised to know that isn't quite true. Because obviously we are an island, but we are surrounded by lots of other countries. And yes, we would have our own 200-mile exclusive economic zone. But guess what? France is not 200 miles away. Some wish it were, but it isn't. Scandinavian countries are not 200 miles away. The Netherlands is not 200 miles away. Iceland is just about 200 miles away, but you know, we know what they're like when it comes to negotiating about fisheries. So we would not be sole sovereign masters of our fisheries resources in the way that is being talked about. However, in fairness, we ought to acknowledge that the EU has caused plenty of environmental problems over the course of the last 25 years. There's no question about that, and will continue, probably, to cause plenty of environmental problems in the future. But what we're talking about here is the balance of benefits and disbenefits. And that's why Friends of the Earth has come forward with the clearest clarion call of all the environmental NGOs at the moment to say that the damage which would be done through Brexit is just so huge that we really shouldn't contemplate it. And their campaign has been exemplary. I have to say that because the rest of the Green movement here in the UK is a little bit less clear about what it can and can't do. They've been somewhat frightened by the Charity Commission trying to scare them off, and Friends of the Earth have had to take on the Charity Commission to campaign in the way they're campaigning now. It might have something to do with the current management of the Charity Commission, but given that this is being filmed, I better not say anything more than that. But if you look at the other big NGOs, you look at the RSPB, whoa, too dangerous, can't touch that. You look at WWF, no, we're not going to come out and tell everyone that this would be an absolute nightmare. You look at CPRE, the Campaign for Rural England, no, we couldn't possibly do that. It's up to our members to decide for themselves. Honestly, I have to say, it's a sorry picture of compromise and obfuscation that you will find out there, which is unfortunate. So hats off to Friends of the Earth for doing it the way they've done it. Okay, that's enough banging on, I think. So I am going to now do some Q&A. I'm going to come down there because I'm feeling a bit stuck up here. And I'm mic'd up so we can do that. And then right at the end, in the last 10 minutes, and I hope you won't all have to rush off absolutely promptly at 2 o'clock, I just want to share with you a new campaign that I am very heavily involved in at the moment called We Are Europe. It's a campaign for young people which we're launching on the 25th of April, and I just want to give you a tiny taste for that if we've got time to do that right at the end. But now let's do a bit of Q&A. Thank you very much.
Hi there. Great talk. Thank you very much, Jonathan. I'm from a local installer of renewables, and I think it's like the Pareto Rule. It's the 80-20 sort of rule. 80% of the EU is great, 20% not so good. In the 80%, the Bathing Water Directive, absolutely fantastic, and a lot of other examples. I mean, that particular one, there's this family story about when we used to go swimming at Watch It, and they always used to say, and that's why they call it Watch It.
Absolutely.
In the 20% sort of side of things, I mean, on the renewables industry, we've got things like the minimum import price. So PV panels are artificially expensive in the EU because of rules about Chinese anti-dumping, for example. And also there's a threat that VAT will be increased from 5% to 20%. So, you know, we feel sometimes like the EU is a juggernaut. We can't sort of steer it. It's inflexible. I mean, how can we sort of, you know, get a better EU? You know, I want to vote in for the 80%. What can we do about the 20% that's niggling us? Yeah,
well, the only way we can do anything about the 20% is by staying in and getting it better. I mean, there's absolutely no opportunity to influence it from outside. That everybody agrees with that. And you're right, on renewables, and even on energy efficiency, although the Energy Efficiency Directive actually is pretty good as a directive. It's just that it hasn't been enforced as effectively as it could have been. But on renewables, it is definitely a mixed picture. And concerns me, for instance, that the German government was so concerned about its rump of PV manufacturing, which is a tiny, tiny part now of global PV manufacturing capacity, still went ahead and tried to prevent the import of PV panels, particularly from China, on the grounds that they had to protect their own industry. So you still get these protectionist spasms, even within a system that is meant to be supranational, meant to represent the whole of the interests of Europe. So that's really difficult. To set against that, don't forget, we do have mandatory targets for renewable energy, which I can assure you would not exist without the EU. Absolutely not. The first thing that Cameron would do would be to get rid of all that, what he called the green crap. And I'm not now talking about other crap we've been talking about, but the green crap, by which he meant all of these things that we have to do progressively to decarbonize our electricity system in the first instance, but then increasingly heat and transport and so on. And those targets, they've been pretty influential in a lot of European countries. We're further down the road now of decarbonization than would have been possible without those mandatory standards. And of course, the UK fought to try and make sure they weren't mandatory. In the end, David Cameron, they signed up to these targets. I think because they didn't really know the difference between energy and electricity, but that's okay. It doesn't really matter. They were signed up to, and then everyone is having to, since then, we're all having to work out how the hell we're going to do this. So there's a bit of both sides, as it were.
Hi, thank you, Jonathan. Great talk. I'm Samantha from House and Water Conditioners. So like my colleague over there, part of the low carbon technology sector, which is quite significant in this area. My question is, you've given us a very clear picture, I think, from your perspective on in or out, but it's a very short time frame between now and the vote. And in what ways would you suggest that we can, it's quite a small group here, in what ways can we actually bring to bear those views to steer this vote, perhaps in our own small ways?
No, I think that's certainly preying on my mind at the moment. And I didn't say very much about the campaign to stay in at the moment, the Stronger In campaign, partly because I think it's good that all our major political parties are advocating that we should stay in the EU. But there are an awful lot of people for whom that kind of leadership, very established politicians and big business, isn't necessarily the kind of voice that they want to hear. And certainly from young people's perspectives, it's absolutely the voice they don't want to hear, because it's that voice that they think has increasingly screwed up prospects for young people in the future, and does not represent what they mean by aspiration for the future. And that's what I'm going to just show you quickly at the end, is how we can do a better job finding opportunities for millennials, for young people, to take a stake in a much more upbeat, visionary approach to Europe. Because at the moment, the debate is not just demeaning to our political system, in my opinion, but it's so negative, it's so depressing, as in taking people down into an increasingly dark place, that you sort of wonder how anybody would bother to get out of bed and vote for this particular choice. So what can we do? I think we do need to combat some of those stereotyped attitudes for or against Europe. We need to be active advocates for this. You mentioned the green economy. Even the CBI now recognizes that the green economy is a hugely important part of the UK economy and will get more and more important. There's no question about that. It's already at least 8% of total GDP, more by some calculations. For us to be in Europe with that huge burgeoning green economy across the whole of Europe, not just on the decarbonisation story, but on innovation in many different areas, just is massively important. So we need to make the economic case, the uplift that we will get through continued involvement in Europe. But you know, so many conversations just go by without anybody challenging the rather sort of crude preconceptions that people have of what Europe means. And we have to speak out. We have to all the time say, really? Do you honestly think that's kind of a sensible way of addressing this stuff? We know it's not perfect. We know it's caused problems, but let's look at the balance of this stuff now. And I think, you know, the fact that so many people have come here today, I think for me demonstrates that there is actually a real desire now to make the debate more accessible, more inclusive in terms of speaking to the things that Europe stands for, not just what it has done or hasn't done, and speaking to the idea of Europe as a much better place for our hopes and ambitions to be fulfilled in the future, not just today.
Martin Bigg from Bristol Green Capital Partnership and the University of the West of England. Jonathon, thank you for being an advocate for green agenda and for the EU. But can I take you back to what you mentioned in terms of other organisations that are not speaking out in terms of the environmental agenda and the European community? Are they being intimidated? Are they being frightened? And if so, what can we do to actually raise the level of engagement amongst organisations which ought to be leading and influencing rather than keeping quiet for fear of upsetting their members or customers?
Yes, well, I have a kind of bad habit of irritating my colleagues in the green movement from time to time with sort of concerns about important aspects of what I see as environmental responsibility going begging. And for me, when I look at an organization, I'm going to be absolutely blunt about this, like the RSPB, much of whose work is essentially based on a framework of EU-derived regulation. If you think about how they operate their reserve strategy, how they helped implement in this country the Birds Directive, the work that they do through the RSPB, then in the international organization, much of their work is at least influenced by, if not directly shaped by, the powerful presence of EU regulations and directives. So for the RSPB to sit on the fence now, for fear of some of its members saying, you know what, that's not our view, and therefore we're going to resign our membership, or for fear of the Charity Commission saying you have no right to campaign for or against in that way, I think is disgraceful. I must be honest, I think it's disgraceful. And I've said to them, so what if 5% of your members leave? So what? Do you or do you not have a position for the collective, for the entity, for the Royal Society itself, for, sorry to put it so bluntly, for the things that you stand for and the causes you support and the creatures and the wildlife and the habitats that you are meant to be out there protecting? It's the same with the Labour Party. After all, some members of the Labour Party will leave the Labour Party because they're campaigning to stay in Europe. It's the same for the Tory Party, for God's sake. They're already starting to lose members. Not as many as you might think, but they are starting to lose members. But of course, they're still saying, in the interest of the nation, we feel it's right to stay in. So I'm pretty worked up about this, I must admit. I'm in the middle of a big debate with Sean Spears in the Council for the Protection of Rural England, who I feel the same way about. And my advice is, give them as hard a time as you possibly can. You know, I'm still a great believer in making yourself an irritant in the system. And there is something still about accountability for chief execs of large organizations. We tend to be very collegiate and friendly with each other, and it's a bit cloying to me that we can't sometimes have these real debates. So I bet you'll remember the RSPB. Nope, good on you, mate. Okay, sorry, cancel. Okay, those who are, check out the website, see the weasel-worded statement that will confront you on the website. Just enjoy it as a exercise in brilliant obfuscatory English, and then fire off a missile to the chief exec and say, really? Is that the best you can do? Because we've got to engage, otherwise they don't know that people are going to be cross. And maybe more people will leave the RSPB because it hasn't taken a clear stance than would leave it if it did. I don't know. I'm not encouraging anybody to leave the RSPB, you understand. We're just saying, get involved.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. You mentioned the common heritage we have in Europe briefly. Thinking of someone in a city, someone who's taken part in European programs and exchanges and projects in the past, I feel a sort of sense of impending loss if we weren't part of a network that brings together people from other cities, people interested in greening businesses, the LIFE programme, the circular economy package that's emerging, all the things where we can learn, we can exchange best practice, because frankly, we don't know the best solutions on our own. And I feel a sense of isolation there'll be. I can't see anything that would replace all of these programmes and opportunities, whether not even green capital. That came with no funding, but it brought many people from Europe here and a lot of attention and thinking about other cities, fellow cities, where we can learn, and we have similar problems. The Sustainable Cities movement and so on, which had a strong European network. And just sipping in a second one, also I've worked with green run cities and regions of Europe run by the Green Party and green groups, sometimes in partnership, sometimes as administration. They can't believe we have a political system, first past the post, where we don't actually have a proper representation in this country to run our cities and regions. So again, we're learning from them, but we haven't kind of taken it on board, obviously. Yet.
No, no, indeed. I've always loved this idea of Europe as a kind of crucible of best practice, as well as a crucible of mediocrity and not such good practice. But in any learning environment, we take what we can and we give back what we can in terms of better and best practice. And I just love that sense of shared learning that goes on across Europe. And funnily enough, we had a particular example of it here. In sort of UE was part of this, where a group of people started taking health practitioners, public health practitioners and climate change campaigners out to visit a city in Germany called Freiburg. And Freiburg's pretty amazing, I can tell you, for all sorts of reasons, not least because of its accelerated decarbonisation campaign, but also because it did all of that in the name of better health, public health, and it's an incredible place to go and visit. And people here took people to visit Freiburg and came back saying, bloody hell, you know, this is amazing. Of course we can do all of this stuff, and we need to learn from this so quickly. So these exchanges, that's a very practical, physical exchange, but the learning that goes on all the time is fundamental. You mentioned innovation. We've got brilliant centres of excellence here in the UK for innovation. We really have. And a lot of them, our climate change science, for instance, is seen as being, without a doubt, the best in Europe. I mean, honestly, nobody would challenge that. And for us to be able to connect with that science back into the whole of Europe is crucial. Other countries in Europe have got equally brilliant centres of innovation. We're not very good at the application of a lot of this stuff. Talking about renewable energy technologies, for instance. You look at the powerhouse in Europe about turning bright ideas into delivered technologies, system software, improvements in how an economy can work. We need all of that. I've drawn for the last 20 years on a place called the Fraunhofer Solar Institute, which has taught me so much about the potential for solar power. And I know we could still be in touch with Fraunhofer, of course we could. It wouldn't mean we couldn't communicate with them, but we wouldn't have any incentive to share a much more engaged pattern of learning. That's the thing I'm standing up for here, and I think that is really crucial. On the PR front, well, we keep cranking along, and eventually we might get to that story where PR looms as a reality, but it's still some way away, I think, for the moment.
one of the arguments for leaving the European Union is that this country is able to take back responsibility for its own behaviour and its own conduct. And you have presented a portrait, really, where you have said that we have to remain in the European Union because our government, and by implication ourselves, are so morally reprobate that we cannot reach proper environmental standards ourselves. And indeed, our environmental NGOs are so supine that they cannot take up the proper challenge and defence of our standards. By staying in the European Union, aren't we just abrogating our responsibilities, not accepting the challenge that really confronts us, and really learning to be what it is, what it means to be a true green and ecologically motivated society?
Yeah. No, I mean that's an exceptionally good point, and I can't disagree with a single word of what you've just said there. And clearly, in the best of all possible worlds for us here in the UK, I would not only totally share that view, but I would be completely enthusiastic about it and would feel that there was so much we could do here in our own terms. There is still so much we can do on our own terms, by the way. The state of our environment is not wholly dependent on the EU and its directives. It is significantly dependent on it, but not wholly dependent on it. And there's a whole story about local environments and improving the quality of our local environments that remains completely untouched, essentially, by much of what goes on in the name of the EU. But let me give you one example of why even though I totally sympathize with what you're saying, I just can't leave it at that. So take the Ambient Air Quality Directive. Sorry, I've got to get a tiny bit geeky on you here. This is the directive that regulates the emissions of certain pollutants, particularly those pollutants we're getting more and more concerned about, not the big pollutants, the sulfur and the nitrogen dioxide and all the rest of it, the very small scale pollutants that are causing significant health problems. The calculation is that these pollutants now are responsible for the deaths of premature deaths of tens of thousands of people across Europe. Our government, and it wasn't just this government, this goes back a long time, a long way, has fought against applying stricter air quality standards in our cities. And it was only by virtue of an inspired campaign from an NGO called Client Earth, which many of you won't have heard of, but it is an extraordinary NGO, which took our government to court over a 5-year battle. Eventually it went to the Supreme Court, and eventually the Supreme Court said, yes, you belong to the EU. You are subject to the mandatory standards that have been enforced on every other member country, and you have to apply them. So you're going to have to improve the quality of the strategy you have to reduce these particular pollutants in our big cities. Government is still fighting this, by the way. Still hasn't met the requirement of the Supreme Court. Client Earth is going to have to go back to the court, because this is a government that will make sure that this gets pushed out as long as it possibly can. By the time we do this, it'll probably be 20 years after the deadline date when we were meant to do it. 20 years. So I look at cases like that and I think to myself, I can't help but think to myself, we need all the support we can get in our country to make for a better physical environment, a healthier environment, a higher quality environment. If I felt that we could just do stuff like that naturally, and we didn't have a succession of governments historically which have fought tooth and nail to slow things down, to resist the path of progress, I would feel more comfortable about a position that I philosophically sign up to. It wouldn't persuade me, by the way, we ought to pull out of the EU, but it would persuade me that we should be doing more proactively to make ourselves an exemplar of the best possible practice in sustainable living in both urban and rural terms. But you raise a very good point, a really very good point.
Wilf Maron from the Bristol Greenpeace Group. I'd like to endorse your position with Friends of the Earth. I think it's quite an astounding commitment, and I'm unfortunate I can't convince Greenpeace to allow us to campaign in the same way. You didn't mention the next threat down the line, which is TTIP, and that's going to also be a major sort of battle on the environmental grounds. And I just wondered if you had a few words, or you could summarise your position on that.
Yes, TTIP is but the latest of a long lineup of agreements essentially to promote freer trade, more free trade between, in this case, between ourselves, the EU, and America. And TTIP has now been batting back and forth for a pretty long time now, still undecided, but still looking as if it'll be signed off in one way or another fairly soon. And I know that for a lot of people in the Green Party, there's only a small number of people in the Green Party who are in favour of getting out of Europe, but there is a voice, and it's raised in Green Party circles. And one of the reasons why they're so concerned is precisely because of global agreements like TTIP and the unaccountable, secretive way in which deals of that kind are stitched up. I mean, getting information about TTIP has been unbelievable. I mean, just impossible to get the data about this stuff. Everything's been negotiated in conditions of near total secrecy, as you know. So I understand that, but then everybody then has to ask the question, do you think that if we come out of Europe, do you think this government, or even a government, a former type Labour administration, it is quite hard speculating about what a new Labour government would do, but an old style new Labour government would have done, a government, let us say, characterised by the leadership of Peter Mandelson, for instance, just to give you a sort of touchstone of, so you know what I mean. Do you think that there would be anything to slow us down from signing up to TTIP the day after we vote to get out of Europe?
Yeah, that's the big danger.
That's the big danger. And the slowing mechanisms at the moment in Europe, laborious though they are all a consequence of the European Parliament now trying to use its influence to bring more of this into the public domain, to get people better informed about it, to ensure the Commission can't just, and the Council of Ministers can't just railroad this through. So, funnily enough, the rather inadequate democratic safeguards that do exist through the European Parliament are sort of vaguely working for the improvement of the debate, but they are not strong enough to, at the moment, to correct that imbalance.
Fraser Bridgeford, Bristol Green Capital Partnership, Nature Division. Just something on a point that was made across there on convincing others that it's good for the environment to stay within the EU. You give us a bit of a history lesson around habitats, about beaches, water quality. So there's perhaps 5 or 6 things we could mention that have happened. What are the 5 or 6 things that won't happen in the future, assuming that all the things that we actually had would stay in place?
Woo. Okay, to give myself time to think about that, let's take the other question.
Yep. My original question was the TTIP one, but I do have another on engagement with young people, because I'm sure the older generation who are against the EU will come out to vote.
Yes.
So I'm looking very much forward to this, and I do believe engagement with youth is essential.
Yes. Okay, perfect segue into what I was about to do, but I can't leave this gentleman completely hanging in the air. It's such a hard question to answer properly, but can I just give you one example of what could happen? Right now, there's a massive debate going on globally about emissions from aviation. And this is a huge sector in the global economy. It could be 3-4% of total global emissions of greenhouse gases. They're completely exempted from the big mainstream process, the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And in Paris last year in December, the agreement was that if the 2 bodies responsible, shipping and aviation, respectively, do not come up with a compelling story about reducing emissions from both sectors, then other bodies will have to intervene again. The EU has had a system of charging for aviation-related emissions on hold now for the last 3 years, pending those negotiated agreements through UN bodies, ICAO and IMO. If they don't come up with a good deal, the EU is going to go back and impose that again on all foreign airlines. So for me, this is an example of what can happen when the EU says, okay, that's not good enough. We know we have to get on top of aviation and shipping, and we're going to do something like that. So if we were out of the EU, you can see we wouldn't be party to that kind of, I think it will become a really big political battleground for the future. So, not a very good answer, sorry about that. But, right. Coming straight to your point, sir, about helping bring this to life for young people. Myself and Caroline Lucas, this isn't a Green Party thing, this is just two dyed-in-the-wool campaigners seeing this horrible gap about young people at the moment being left pretty much in the lurch of what's going on here. And what we're going to be launching on April the 25th is this new campaign, which will address this point. You can't read this, but you can basically see what these bar charts are telling you, which is an extremely simple story, okay? Over here, you have support for the EU, depending on the age. Younger, older, okay? So enthusiasm for the EU amongst the younger people, pretty good. The older you get, the grumpier you get about the EU, basically. Over here, what you have is the likelihood of people voting in terms of their age. So here, younger people, far less likely to turn out and vote in the referendum. And over here, very, very strong likelihood of the older part of our electorates turning out to vote. And they will turn out to vote there. So the extraordinary thing is that for a decision that has a bigger impact on young people than any other decision that they are likely to take for a very long time, there is at the moment a massive gap between basic attitudes towards the EU, which are sort of vaguely pro, but we don't quite know why, and likelihood of voting. So this is what we are trying to address as best we can. And that's because under 40s sort of know that there's, that the EU sort of works reasonably well, but they don't have any compelling arguments. Coming back to the question about what should we do ourselves to stand up and be counted on this stuff, how do we make these arguments come alive? First of all, we just don't need to tell people to vote, but we have to get people to be enthusiastic about the EU, and that involves more than this, okay? This is the stronger in kind of messaging, okay? It's all about the Union Jack. It's all about crazy stories. It's all about blokes in ties. Oh, God, it goes on and on and on. And even when they launched their Our Future thingy, which is the campaign for young people on university campuses, which was launched in Exeter yesterday, it still looks tired. So our mission is a little bit differently. It's to change the rules, if you like. It's an in campaign with people actually believing that this is the right thing to be doing, not weighing up the balance of fear, as I call it. Oh God, I'm really scared about staying in, and I'm really even more scared about getting out. So this is no good basis on which to build a referendum campaign. So we want to move towards this kind of story here, where we begin to think about what is it that would make people proud of our role in Europe, making in feel real and personal, and then persuading young people to vote. Because a huge number of young people who could vote probably aren't even registered at the moment, which is our first challenge, amazingly. So it'll be completely led by young people. It's true that Caroline and myself at the moment are raising all the money. That's okay. That's the kind of thing that you do when you get older and a bit wiser. You go out and raise the money and then hand it over. Okay, just go and do this stuff, because I wouldn't know how to run a digital campaign to persuade young people to get behind this. But this is going to be a digital campaign, completely social media driven. It'll all be run by a group of young people who've all now signed up for this, and we're meeting tomorrow to actually start putting the sort of bones of this stuff together. We're going to be concentrating probably on 6 of these big themes: global justice, culture and the arts, travel, relationships. Young people call these things passion points, by the way. They don't call them themes, which I'm very relieved about. They're passion points. So we're going to be big on passion points, because that's what matters. The tone is going to be human, It's not going to be sort of mediated via these awful fear-driven messages about what will happen if we get out of Europe. The whole idea is to bring it alive, very much as has happened in different campaigns around the world. Wonderful campaign, for instance, about the election of Trudeau in Canada, where young people just suddenly realize, God, we can have a politician who speaks our language. Do you know what this would look like as a young person? To have a leader who could speak young. So we want to kind of capture that. We have this whole story about shareable vision, visual stuff, public space to be proud of, uni life, you know, this whole business about why our universities are better. We'll work with what are called trusted influencers, millennial influencers, people like Lily Cole, Emma Watson, what's his name now? Jamal Edwards, very influential vlogger. Okay, see, getting the hang of all this stuff. And there will be a touch of friction, as you can imagine, because although we want to make the whole thing completely upbeat and very positive so that young people can feel genuinely excited and proud of what they're doing to take the case out about staying in Europe, we need a bit of friction. Because this is my worst nightmare. I don't know whether I don't know whether any of you are in the same place, but this the morning after is a prospect so awful to contemplate that we've got to do everything in our power to stop that happening. We've just got to do everything in our power. So this is basically it. We're launching on the 25th, and we, by that stage, hopefully will have a number of influential people who will be getting behind the campaign. And at that point, this group of 20 young people will simply run with it and make it happen. And hopefully then as many young people as possible will get stuck in. So that's... Thank you.